right, let's kick things off. Welcome back to part 3 of our 4-part FAA test prep. If anyone's in the room for the first time here, this is a 4-part course, and you already missed parts 1 and 2, but we're recording it and we're going to, we'll pass out all the slides and additional documentation, so feel free to shoot me an email to that address or drop your card if you want the rest of the whole presentation. For everyone else, welcome back. We have made it through the most tedious and most difficult parts of the Part 107 test prep. So what we are going to cover today for the next hour and a half or so are going to be things like human factors of flight as well as small UAV operational considerations. And then for the 4th part, we're going to cover what the actual test day looks like, as well as some of the real kind of practical applications of these laws and how they may differ slightly in practice from what the actual FAA textbook says. So with that, I'm going to make my computer flashlight crazy. And then pull it up. As before, please interrupt me with any questions. I'll do my best to keep it lively after a nice food coma that I'm sure everyone is in. But at least, like I said, we're through the weather part, which is the hardest. So I'll try and do my best to keep you awake with small UAS operational knowledge. So, what this one is about, small UAS operational knowledge, is kind of as it says, the actual operations behind operating a UAV. Now, for those of you that have operated UAVs for either hobby purposes or commercial purposes or really anything before, this is going to be a heck of a lot different than what you're used to. Like almost literally everything I've said today, what the FAA has in the textbook and what it's like in real life are just totally different, separate things. So we'll talk about things like determining performance of the FUAS, things about turn angles and bank angles and load factors, maintenance and inspection, emergency procedures, but all of this from the lens of how the FAA views these things, not from the lens of what actually makes for a good and efficient operation. These things don't even really require that much maintenance typically, but all of that's going to be part of the test as well. So let's just dive right in. We've talked a lot about the pilot in command, remote pilot in command, and that sort of thing. PIC is responsible for the entire mission, as we have discussed, but that also means that they are responsible to verify that the aircraft is correctly loaded and balanced, and also to they are responsible to make sure that the aircraft is in a condition fit to fly. Now, what this means is that if you have an intern in your office and he said, yep, I checked out the aircraft and it's good to go, then you are not legally allowed to just pull it out of the box and assume that he did his job right. It is your job as the pilot in command to do those inspections, to verify everything and make sure that it's accurate. This is something that comes from manned aviation, and in fact, you might have even seen it at commercial airports sometimes. The pilot of an actual airplane will very frequently get out, throw on a little safety vest, walk down and walk around his aircraft and look at everything. Because he's the captain and it's his job to make sure that that aircraft is fit to fly. Even though he's got a crew of 100 other people, the buck stops with him. Likewise, with the FAA, remote pilot command, in pretty much all of these circumstances, the buck stops with you. The buck stops with you as a pilot. So it's your responsibility to verify that it's loaded and balanced and in a condition fit to fly. Now we're going to talk about loading and balancing a lot in this module as well. With most modern electric small UAVs, that is a non-issue. They're built, they have an integrated payload, or at most maybe 2 or 3 interchangeable payloads. So load and balance doesn't change. It's not like you're putting on extra payloads or something like that, but it's a big focus of the FAA's test, making sure that it's all proper, because that is a big issue in manned aviation. In manned aviation, things that we figured out through honestly deadly accidents in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, if you put too much weight in one side of the aircraft and the pilot doesn't know about it, the aircraft is going to fly horribly. Again, small electric multi-rotors, not that much of a deal. But if you ever were to attach any external payloads to your aircraft, this would make a huge, 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 huge difference. Determining performance of the UAS. Again, responsibility falls onto the remote pilot in command. However, the performance characteristics are almost always going to come from the manufacturer. With small UAVs, there are, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of manufacturers that make small UAVs out there, and an even more large number of people that will build or customize their own UAVs. Maybe they'll buy some parts, put some motors and some flight controllers together and build them. So that means there's no standardized set of data from the FAA. Now, most manufacturers and anyone that's going to be selling commercial grade aircraft are typically going to have a list of performance characteristics they'll list out there with it. Things like operational ceiling, what's the highest altitude that it can safely fly at, the expected battery life under ideal conditions, blah, blah, blah. Weight and balance restrictions, if they do exist, are going to be established by the manufacturer, and their restrictions should be closely followed. Now, this has a weird implication to it, because that means that the manufacturer of the aircraft itself can actually set what is legal and what is not. And breaking the terms and conditions, or something like that, actually can be a violation of FAA Part 107 law. If the manufacturer says, nope, this one's not designed to carry any payload, and you strap a payload on it and crash, that is your fault as the remote pilot in command, because the manufacturer said otherwise. Manufacturer's guidelines are going to be a recurring theme of this module on operational considerations. Just because there's such a huge, wide range of different aircraft types, you can have them with 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 or more propellers in all number of configurations, fixed wings, hybrid fixed wings, vertical takeoff and landing ones that then tilt rotor, all sorts of craziness. And the FAA doesn't restrict what type of aircraft can exist. Heck, a lot of the drones out there today didn't exist at all 2 years ago. So they don't try and restrict what type of drones there are. Instead, they push that onto the manufacturer and say, that's where the guidelines are going to come from, the safe operating parameters. So if I have kind of my cheat sheet on this module, whenever you get UAV operational things, if a test question has a possible answer that is do what the manufacturer says, there's a good chance that's going to be right. And if the manufacturer doesn't do it, then it's your responsibility to create and figure out what those safety limitations are yourself. On the right, you'll see some of the just examples of things that are set by the manufacturer. Weight, including battery and propellers, maximum ascent speed, maximum descent speed, lateral speed, service ceiling, flight time, and operating temperatures. Now, these are, in almost all circumstances, going to be more restricted than Part 107 in the letter of Part 107. For example, in Part 107, we were saying that you can't go more than 100 miles an hour or 87 knots, which is ridiculously fast. But the aircraft manufacturer might say this aircraft is only rated to go 30 miles an hour, and anything beyond that will make it structurally unsafe. In that case, you cannot go above 30 miles an hour because that is the performance capability of your aircraft, and exceeding it will exceed the design specifications of the aircraft and could result in some sort of loss of control or crash or something like that. So the design specs from the manufacturer should be closely followed. So let's talk about weight and balance now. This is not a drone, if you couldn't tell. This is an actual airplane, and this is what the FAA actually cares about when they're talking about weight and balance. Because on this tiny little manned aircraft, weight and balance is the difference between a lot of people who have died from screwing it up over the past 100 years, like I mentioned, which is why the FAA really cares about it. Probably will have negligible impact on you as a drone pilot, but it matters so much to manned aviation that it is a legally required part of this text, at least understanding the way that weight and balance can actually impact the aircraft. So you'll see a couple of things down here. You have that CG spot right there. That's going to be your center of gravity. And here you have your center of lift as well, which is where the upward force comes from. And you can see from the fact that they're not the same that normally the aircraft would kind of go into a nosedive, unless there's that also that tail drag right here that's actually putting downward pressure on the aircraft to balance for the fact that the center of gravity is in front of the wing, the center of lift. This is typical for most aircraft, but one of the things to remember is that excessive weight reduces the flight performance in almost every single respect. Pretty intuitive there. The more it weighs, the worse it is to fly. That's just kind of one of those nasty things about physics and aviation, is that weight is the absolute enemy of pretty much everything you're trying to do. And that part actually is totally true with aircraft, or with drone aircraft as well. every ounce of weight that you put on an extra aircraft for whatever reason will reduce the flight performance in almost every respect. It will be slower, its flight time will be longer, it will handle worse in wind, it will have a reduced rate of climb, lower maximum altitude, shorter range, and on and on and on and on and on. But either way, excessive weight, that one is definitely consistent throughout. Weight is a bad thing. The lighter you can get an aircraft in all circumstances, the better. Moving on, load factor. This is the amount of force on the aircraft relative to its weight. So spoken in G forces, multiples of gravity, that means 2 G's on the load on the aircraft, or 2 G's means the load on the aircraft is twice its weight. While usually related to fixed wing aircraft, this is, again, fully, totally in-game for test questions. So an aircraft sitting on the ground, not flying whatsoever, is going to be at just, 1 G. It just has its own weight. As it starts to turn and bank, the steeper the turn and the faster it's going, the more load is going to be put on that. Imagine, you're cornering in a car and it pushes you down in the seat. Exact same principles, but much, much, much more impactful with aircraft. Because a lot of aircraft can make steep banks, and heck, if you watch Top Gun or something, you can get a pilot to black out from putting them under too many Gs. Or, in the case of smaller aircraft and fixed-wing aircraft, if you put it under too much of a load factor, the wings can possibly break off, and you're going to have a bad time. So let's go over calculating it. This is a chart that is in your supplements guide when you get the test. So those 2 charts on the right, you will actually get those. And you may be asked to calculate the force on an aircraft structure. And that's based off of the load factor. So the way that it works is if your angle of bank is 0 degrees, you're in straight and level flight, then the only force load factor on the aircraft is going to be the weight of the aircraft itself, so 1.0. And the steeper you turn, this assumes that you're actually staying at the same altitude, the steeper you turn, the more force you have to put in to stay at the same altitude, which means the higher the load factor. And as you can see, it's just a multiple. So if you bank at 10 degrees, it's 1.015. That's a 1.5% increase. All the way up to 85 degrees, it's 11.5 Gs, something that would be almost impossible for your human to survive. And at 90 degrees, it becomes, just by the laws of physics, impossible to even stay in the air because all of your lift is going sideways, so the drone would just kind of sideways fall into the ground, or the aircraft would. So taking a fairly simple example here, an aircraft that weighs 30 pounds making a 45-degree turn while maintaining altitude. So the question might say something along the lines of, a 30-pound aircraft is making a 45-degree turn while maintaining altitude. What is the effective force on the aircraft structure? And so the way to do that is we just kind of look it up in this table. Okay, 45-degree turn, we look that up here, 1.414 is the load factor. That means the weight, the force on the aircraft structure is 1.414 times the weight of the aircraft. So you just multiply that out, and the answer to that question would be 42.4 pounds. Yeah?
Is there a speed component to this, like faster you're going?
So the way that it worked, not really, because this assumes that you are maintaining altitude. So if you go faster, just at the same level, you wind up actually kind of gaining altitude. If you go too slow, you lose altitude. So this assumes that you have adjusted the speed properly such that you are maintaining altitude at that angle. All right. So like I said, load factor increases with steeper turns, and that's the chart. You will have access to that chart again in the supplements guide, and it'll actually point you to the page. And at 90 degrees, it becomes impossible to stay airborne as the aircraft is no longer producing any vertical lift at all. Any more questions on load factor? Going back to some nice high school multiplication math. Fun stuff. Next up is stall speeds. So a stall, the way wings work, they need smooth air flowing over the wings, and a stall happens when there is a rapid decrease in lift when the angle of attack of a wing is exceeded. So that's kind of a cross-section over there on your right of what a wing looks like. The wing's moving forward over the wing, it generates lift. If the drone goes too steep, the angle of attack where it's going after the air gets too steep, you get that turbulent air behind, you lose lift, and you drop out of the sky. Not a problem at all for multi-rotors. Fixed wings, absolutely a problem. In most day-to-day operations, this is all going to be software handled, but it's very much a consideration. You try and get the drone to climb at too steep of an angle, and it'll just drop out of the sky because it doesn't have the power to overcome a stalled wing. So the stall speeds, this is kind of one of those sentences that's good to remember for the test. Stall speeds increase with higher load factors. So let's talk about what that means. As you are making a turn, so you're at 45 degrees, let's call it, you have that 1.4 load factor that we were talking about. That means that the stall speed increases. The speed at which your wing is going to lose lift is higher than it was before. So I'm going to say that again. Stall speeds increase with higher load factors. And again, the whole point of that is that the more force you put on the aircraft, the faster it has to go to keep it in the air. As far as some of the performance characteristics of aircraft goes, this is going to be the same thing with putting more weight on an aircraft. The more weight you put on an aircraft, the faster that thing's going to have to go in order to stay in the air, because those wings have to generate a heck of a lot more lift. So if you take any sort of fixed wing aircraft, and this is very true for drones as well, and you start adding additional stuff on it, whether that's additional GPS antennas, more batteries, bigger cameras, blah, 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 that's going to increase the stall speed, meaning that that drone's got to go faster and faster and faster and faster to stay in the air with the same wing, same airframe, and that sort of thing. So, as we were talking about before, those manufacturers' load and balance guidelines, you overload an aircraft, your performance degrades in basically every single way, and your stall speed's going to increase as well. But this question about stall speeds increasing with higher load factors is another common one that we see on the exam. All right, maintenance. Whenever possible, the operator should maintain the aircraft and its components in accordance with the manufacturer's instructions. Kind of like I said before, when in doubt, you can defer to whatever the manufacturer tells you to do. And the same is true with maintenance. If there is not a manufacturer's maintenance set of instructions, it is your responsibility as a remote pilot in command to make one and to make sure that your aircraft is maintained in compliance with your own manufacturer's maintenance program. Does this all make sense? This stuff isn't nearly as complicated. Scheduled maintenance. The manufacturer may also provide documentation for scheduled maintenance of the entire unmanned aircraft and associated systems and equipment. And if there are no scheduled maintenance instructions provided by the SUAS manufacturer or component manufacturer, the operator should establish a scheduled maintenance program. Pretty straightforward. If they tell you what to do it. If they don't tell you what to do, you've got to do it yourself. That's true through a lot of this stuff.
Do you need to document this in case you're back?
I'm double checking in my brain. No, I'm pretty sure you don't need to document it legally, and that is not part of the text of Part 107 to document your maintenance procedures. That said, it's not a bad idea, certainly, and one of the parts that is in the law is that the administrator may request to see your maintenance logs at any point. If you don't have them, it's not a violation of the law, but you should generally have them just for good practice, and they may request documentation if you do have it. Putting back on kind of the real world hat, these things take so little maintenance. Usually maintenance only happens if you crash it and need to repair it, in which case my recommendation is typically to go with first party repairs, just because these things are pretty sensitive to if someone were to repair it poorly and have a propeller fall off, bad times. But yeah, you don't legally need to document maintenance to be in compliance with Part 107, but you need to turn over what maintenance records you have if requested by the FAA. All right, unscheduled maintenance. You may discover a part that needs servicing or replacing. We've got this nice picture here of a coil coming out from inside of a motor housing on one of our small propellers. Also, a manufacturer may require an unscheduled system or software upgrade to correct a problem, and if such a condition is found, you should not conduct operations until the issue is corrected. The FAA does not prescribe necessarily how you have to correct these issues, whether you repair it yourself, you send it to the manufacturer for a recall, et cetera, et cetera. But the biggest thing is that, kind of like a lot of this stuff, if you ever have reason to know or you should have reason to believe that your aircraft is not in a safe condition for flight, then it is not legal to fly with it. You got to get it fixed first. You think a motor might be bad? You got to fix the motor. You think that a propeller is busted? You got to fix the propeller or something along those lines. So again, there's a lot of weight put on the manufacturer to actually push out any known issues and get those fixed. Performing maintenance. Am I a broken record yet? It's highly recommended that the maintenance be performed in accordance with the manufacturer's instructions. And also, this is another part that is in the text of the law directly. Consider the expertise of maintenance personnel familiar with the specific SUAS and its components. Now, what does that one mean in terms of the law? It means that if you broke your drone, you can't just find a kid on your block who's generally a little good with technology and say, hey kid, fix this. And he says, yep, yes sir, I fixed it, you're good to go. That would not be in compliance with the law because you did not consider the expertise of the maintenance personnel and their familiarity with the drone and its components. So it's another one of those kind of catch-all laws of, hey, don't do something stupid, please. If you try and do things too cheap and it winds up causing a problem, then you're still responsible. So let's talk next about pre-flight inspections. If you remember from part 1, the text of the SUAS Part 107 rule, before each flight, you must inspect the aircraft to ensure it is in a safe condition of operation. Thankfully, there are no super detailed checklists that the FAA sets. It would be a pain if they were, because they'd probably want you to totally disassemble every motor and every propeller and battery and whatnot to make sure that it all works. But instead they say, again, sorry, I know I'm boring, should be conducted in accordance with the manufacturer's inspection procedures where available. As an option, you can create an inspection program for your own SUAS, and checklists are useful but not a legally required method of performing inspections. In the real world, manufacturers typically don't have their own inspection checklists. You can develop your own. We have some that we publish for free on our website as well if you want some of those just checklists that are good for knowing which parts of the aircraft you inspect to make sure it's safe. From a test standpoint, you just need to inspect the aircraft. You don't need to memorize, an order or which components or anything like that. You just need to inspect it. And it's recommended to use the manufacturer's guidance, or you can create your own. All right. Next up is emergency procedures. During an emergency, a remote pilot is permitted to deviate from any part of the rules of Part 107 to respond to an emergency. This is actually a really good rule, and it is part of the text of Part 107. We spent a lot of the rest of today laying out all of the laws. You have to do this, you have to do this, you can't do this, you can't do that. Well, there's one exception to that. You can do literally anything to respond to what you, as the pilot in command, consider to be an emergency. If that means flying in controlled airspace, done. Legal now because it's an emergency. Means flying above 400 feet for some reason? Absolutely yes. All you have to do is when you do deviate from these rules, you may be asked by the administrator to explain why you did so. You don't have to file any reports. You don't have to say, hey, I flew over 400 feet, here's why. This is only if they request it from you. But during an in-flight emergency, the pilot may take any action at all to ensure that there is no hazard to other people or property. Now let me give you a real-world example of this. This actually does come into play sometimes. So our friends in the manned aircraft world, they have their own set of laws. Like I said, they typically have to fly above 500 feet. But they don't follow the law just as much as a lot of other normal people don't follow the law. And I had a friend of mine who was a pilot. He was flying out at a rural mine, middle of nowhere or something. And he was flying a mission at 400 feet, pretty standard. And all of a sudden, a helicopter comes over the ridge. And this helicopter's looking really low flying. And he was so worried that it was flying into his airspace, even though he knew he was a manned aircraft pilot himself. He knew that it was illegal for a helicopter to be there, but he saw it flying at about his altitude. So he went up. He said that the best way for me to get out of this guy's line is to just go straight up. So he shot his drone up to, 700-800 feet, Helicopter flew by, no problem, nothing happened. Now, was he breaking the law there? The correct legal answer is no, he was not breaking the law. Because that was an emergency, and he is allowed to take any action necessary to avoid that emergency. And even though Part 107 says you must stay below 400 feet, if there's an emergency and the safe course of action requires you to go above that, then that becomes legal. And it is legal to deviate from literally any rule whatsoever in an emergency, and all you have to do is be able to defend yourself. And that's what it says. So no filings or anything, that might be on a question. If there's an emergency, what do you have to do? File paperwork within 10 days? Nope, you only have to file paperwork within 10 days if there's damage on the ground. But do you have to, give it to the administrator on request? Yes, you do. Questions about kind of your emergency procedures? All right. Next up, this is another slide that exists because it's a very common question. Scanning techniques. You are required to see and avoid. You're required to keep an eye on the airspace around you and look for obstacles. The FAA has a very explicit set of scanning techniques for how you need to look at the sky to actually find anything. You guys are mostly surveyors. Actually, I'm curious, by a show of hands, how many people in here are actual, registered surveyors? Okay, yeah, I assumed it would be basically everyone. So you guys are used to looking at the land and understanding it. But scanning the sky gets a little tricky because your eyes like to play tricks on you. Now all of a sudden, instead of just left and right, you have a heck of a lot more up and down. So the FAA's prescribed way to do this is you must look from left to right or right to left, start at the greatest distance an object can be perceived at the top, and then move inward towards the position of the aircraft at the bottom. And for each stop, an area approximately 30 degrees wide should be scanned. Why is it 30 degrees? You know what? I don't really know. They probably commissioned some study at some point and that said that 30 degrees is the most effective width that you should scan before turning and looking back and forth, back and forth. But that's the type of question they would have, that this is the recommended scanning technique. Start at one spot far away, scan left to right, right to left, with each stop approximately 30 degrees wide. Another might be useful to, or generally useful to scan in real life. Why does it have to be 30 degrees? It kind of doesn't, but that's the type of thing that they'll ask on the test. There might be an answer, yeah, scan 30 degrees. Sitting, spinning in a circle, going like that, not an appropriate answer. So that's really all we have for small UAS operational knowledge, at least. It's pretty short module, pretty easy, because so much of it is just rely on what the manufacturer says. If it's not there, do it yourself. And then some of these scanning techniques. So there are a couple of those specifics on the test. Like I said, this 30-degree scanning technique, a lot of these emergency procedures. I mean, heck, a lot of this stuff, it's not complicated, but it'll show up word for word on the test, something along these lines. All right, we're going blasting through this. Any questions on the operational knowledge, any of that stuff? Man, they fed everyone too well. Getting people sleep. I need to get a t-shirt cannon and some confetti. Help me stay awake too.
Coffee.
Yes. And some coffee. Now, let's get back here to our next one. Human factors of flight. So, final module of the detailed actual kind of stuff that's going to be covered on the test. Human factors of flight. So these are all of the even softer, even squishier things that impact aviation safety in general. It's broken up into three broad speaking categories: aeronautical decision-making, crew resource management, and physiological factors. All of the information here, as with everything else, could be on the test, and they actually do care about knowing these acronyms and actually knowing what some of this means. CRM might mean customer relationship management software to most people, but for the FAA, crew resource management. So why is this one a big deal? This one the FAA cares about because it's bad crew resource management that has led to most aviation disasters in the last 30 years. It's always a tragedy. I think that going through this process helps more than anything. helps me gain respect for the FAA and for what pilots of commercial airliners do on a day-to-day basis. Because this is the type of stuff that, especially in commercial airliners, absolutely saves lives. And for you guys, monitoring this sort of stuff and worrying about decision-making for resource management, you don't really have lives at stake with the drone, but you've got a couple $1,000s in the air, and bad communication and bad attitudes that's how drones crash. So yeah, this section, I like to think of it in lens of traditional aviation, just because it's why the FAA and why the American airline system is as safe as it is today. So I kind of like talking about it just because the FAA pisses me off when they make you learn weather decoding, but then when they get you on an airplane safely from A to B, that's a good thing. So, what is aeronautical decision making? It is a systematic approach to the mental processes used by pilots to determine the best course of action based on the latest information. So, kind of buzzwordy, jargony, probably a bad statement to throw out after lunch because you can kind of say that and hear nothing at the same time. But the key things to remember is that it's a systematic approach. It's actually a physical set. It's a body of like, hey, here are the different factors that you need to take into account. It's meant to reduce the human factor, which leads to error. By having this systematic process, you must go through a fixed number of steps, a fixed number, like analyze risk in a fixed way. It reduces that human factor. And like I said, an estimated 80% of aviation accidents are related to human factors. That means the aircraft itself was fine, your load and balance were fine, they may have even been following the law perfectly fine. But because people were communicating poorly, someone saw a problem, and they didn't tell the captain because they assumed the captain saw it too, then all of a sudden there's a crash. It's the same thing with drones. If you've got another person working on the job, or you've got a visual observer, and they see a power line, they're like, no, he probably sees it. And then he doesn't say anything, and then you crash into a power line. That's kind of the type of thing about getting all this data together to make sure that those human factors don't actually cause crashes. So, what are these steps for good aeronautical decision making, for a good ADM program? Step 1, identify personal attitudes that are hazardous to safe flight. So we'll talk a little bit about those attitudes later, but it's the idea of like, what are the attitudes that can get you to, that can cause someone to fly dangerously even if they aren't fully aware of it. For example, hold my beer is not a good attitude for starting a drone flight. Learning behavior modification techniques is another good skill that is helping to identify in the pilot, in yourself, what are some of the behaviors that are causing potentially high-risk behaviors, and how do I modify that to make sure that I follow the right procedures. Checklists are a really good example of how to incorporate good decision-making, good aeronautical decision-making throughout the entire process. You don't have to worry about remembering that you do everything, or say like, I know this, I've done this a million times before. It's a bad attitude for flight. Saying that, like, I've got this, no worries, is a bad attitude for flight, and using checklists can help overcome this. Again, with manned aviation, checklists are absolutely ubiquitous, all over the place. And it's not because pilots aren't skilled, but because it helps remove that human factor. It just makes the possibility for a mistake that much lower. Learning how to recognize and cope with stress. Stress is a huge, huge, huge cause of aviation mishaps and accidents. You're tired, you're exhausted, you're under a huge amount of pressure from work, and that makes you push the limits on everything that you do. Maybe you're flying in weather that you know you probably shouldn't be flying on, or maybe it's like, man, I've got to get this job in before tomorrow, and yeah, it's raining, but I'll wait for a 30-second break in the clouds, and so you take off, and then the rain opens up, and then you crash. Those are kind of the different things that you need to be aware of with aeronautical decision-making. Developing risk assessment skills, knowing what kind of risks you're actually taking. Using all resources available to you, too. That means that just knowing that there are weather forecasts out there is not good enough. You need to actually use your weather forecasts. And then evaluating the effectiveness of one's aeronautical decision-making skills, that puts it in a whole kind of loop so that you're constantly improving yourself. Aeronautical decision-making is not a fixed, hey, here's what you do, and now, ta-da, you're a perfect pilot. It's a constantly improving feedback loop, that you talk about this, you recognize your own problems, and then you improve them, and then you keep analyzing yourself to keep trying to reduce that risk further and further and further. So there are 4 fundamentals to aeronautical decision-making in general. The first one is to accept no unnecessary risk. Now there's some risk that is considered necessary. For example, anytime you are flying, there is risk. That risk is called gravity. It's a pain. But that is necessary risk. But accept no unnecessary risk. That means don't show off when you don't have to. Don't take on new risks that aren't important to the operation. It's something that unfortunately we see all too often in the real world too. And this is, like I said, this part is really true in both the test and in the real world. Most of the drone accidents that we see from our kind of business perspective are caused by really just crappy and unsafe attitudes. We had one that, I kind of feel bad, the guy got fired for this and probably should have been. He went into the office after it had closed, took they had a nice commercial, like $5,000 drone or something, took it without telling anyone, wanted to show off his new piloting skills to his friends. So he took it out in the middle of the night to show off some friends after having a couple of beers and was saying, look at how cool this thing is for flying. And he's never flown at night before. He'd never flown at low altitude. He was mostly with autopilot in the middle of the day with visual observers. And sure enough, he crashed his $5,000 drone into a tree and wrecked it. And our support guys got a call like at 9 o'clock at night, like, I really need your help. I just crashed a drone. Can you help me? Not really. You just crashed a drone because you were showing off and drinking in front of your friend. So yeah, he got in a lot of trouble for that. Make decisions at the appropriate level. That means make decisions at the level where they can actually be acted upon. So typically for drones, that means the remote pilot in command is making a lot of these decisions because he's the one that can actually impact it. Having someone that is the boss of your organization make these decisions and say, you must do X, Y, and Z, and then 2 or 3 steps down the chain, it doesn't really get followed through, that's not good enough for aeronautical decision making. That's considered too much risk. You should accept risk when the benefits outweigh the dangers. Obviously, like I said, there's always risk, but you need to be aware that there are risks and benefits and weigh them. And then that calculus changes when there are emergency situations as well. So you need to know, okay, there are 2 different paths I could take. I could either turn into the storm or I could turn into, where there's a roadway and have to fly over some roadway. What's the risk and benefit of each? The answer isn't always clear, but knowing that you should accept risk when the benefits outweigh the dangers is part of that aeronautical decision-making fundamentals. And lastly, you must integrate risk management into planning at all levels. So while it is the remote pilot in command's responsibility, a good aeronautical decision-making process incorporates this risk management planning into every level of the organization. From the beginning of, okay, when do I fly? How high should I fly this mission? Is it worth it? I mean, there's a risk because we're trying to do this mission under a tight deadline. Is that worth it? There should be risk management and understanding that it's not just a simple binary yes-no, right? If I go out and fly on this day, is my drone going to crash? It's not a yes-no, there's a risk level to it. Will you go out and fly today? It looks like the snow's probably just almost stopped. Is the drone going to crash? It's probably okay. But you know what? That's a pretty high level of risk right there. Having it snow, because most drones are not going to actually be built to withstand that level of precipitation. So then, going to the next step, we talked about some of those hazardous attitudes. What are these hazardous attitudes? These are kind of 5 very common hazardous attitudes that you also might be tested on, of what they are and then what the antidote is to them. They're pretty simple when you think about it, but that's kind of the point of a lot of this, is making sure that you think about it. It's when you don't think about this that it kind of becomes a problem. So the test might say, okay, give me, what is the hazardous attitude that's associated with a boss coming on and saying, hey, I need you to go outside and I need you to fly this, we gotta get this done, we gotta get this sealed by the end of the day, go fly it. What's the hazardous decision-making attitude there? Well, impulsivity, do it quickly. And the antidote is to say, no, not so fast, you gotta think first. And as far as from a legal perspective, whose responsibility is it to actually say, whoa, 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 hold up. I can't do that, I can't fly right now. It's a remote pilot in command. And it's about not accepting that pressure from higher up, because the buck stops with you as the pilot. Same thing with all of these other things. It won't happen to me. I'm invulnerable. I've done 1,000 missions before. I know what I'm doing. That's going to be that idea of invulnerability. Just because you've flown 1,000 flights safely before does not mean that there is any less risk to your 1,001st flight than to your first flight. And the solution? Think it could happen to me. So there are other hazardous attitudes as well. Anti-authority, you can't tell me what to do. Those jerks at the FAA, they're not my boss, you're not my supervisor. But the antidote, follow the rules, they're usually right. Machismo, again, I can do it. That's kind of a hold my beer sort of attitude. Taking chances is foolish is what you need to think. And then resignation, what's the point? That's another common one of like, is it even worth it to go through these inspection procedures? Like, why am I doing this? I've inspected my aircraft 100 times before, and I haven't found any problems. But that's an example of this resignation attitude, where no, you're not helpless. You can make a difference. And you know what? Once you start getting the scale that we're seeing a lot of these commercial operations at, where you're flying every month, every week, or sometimes every day, and multiple times a day, yeah, you've still got to go through the checklist. And your goal is to get rid of those 1 in 100 errors, or 1 in 1,000 errors, and still catch them before they happen, so that you can prevent an accident. And these are the types of hazardous attitudes that I'm always torn, because it is such a simple thing to look at and say, well, duh, if you get too much impulsivity and say do it quickly, the answer is slow down and think first. But this really, really does matter in the real world too. Slowing down, taking your time, going through the processes, using checklists, and being aware more than anything. Being aware of these hazardous attitudes so that when they do come up, that you can say, nope, I'm not going to do it, and that way you're going to protect your investment. And that's really what you guys are going to care about a lot more too, is protecting your investment in all of this hardware too. I mean, no commercial drone is going to be less than $1,000 that you guys will be flying, and some of them will be a heck of a lot more expensive than that. So just protecting the money in that's flying above you is going to be pretty important. All right, so the FAA has a delightful acronym that they use for mitigating risk. They call it the I Am Safe Checklist. So these are 6 questions that you should ask yourself when you are planning for a mission to determine if you are safe. Illness, for I, asking, am I sick? Do I have any sort of illness that could be degrading my ability to fly? Something like the flu, you have a fever, you're hallucinating or something, probably a bad idea to go flying. Medication, am I taking any medications that might affect my judgment? That includes absolutely everything. Over-the-counter medications, prescription medications, painkillers, even super common ones like just Benadryl can have an impact on you. Stress, am I under any psychological pressure from my job? Do I have money, health, or family problems? I'm pretty sure we go into stress more, but there are a lot of different types of stress. There's acute stress, which can come on from a big project, all the way to chronic stress, which can happen from just being stressed at work or at home for days and days on end. Those are oftentimes harder to even be aware of and diagnose. Alcohol. Have I been drinking within the last 8 hours, 24 hours? The legal rules for flying under the influence of alcohol are considerably more strict than the rules for driving under the influence of alcohol. I'm pretty sure, I think it's on another slide. Yeah, it's on there later, but I'm pretty sure it's 0.04% is the blood alcohol limit for flying. Kind of surprising that it's not 0, but either way, the risks of alcohol are very commonly known, and they're a lot stricter with aviation than they are with driving. Fatigue, am I tired and not adequately rested? And then emotion, am I emotionally upset? Now again, I'm going to take another opportunity to actually give the FAA credit where credit is due. The reason these things exist, the reason this checklist is here, is that unfortunately over the history of aviation and manned flight, every single one of those letters has caused thousands of deaths. That's kind of a weird way to look at it for me. That when we talk about things like fatigue, just asking yourself, am I tired? Well, they wouldn't be asking that if there weren't a lot of commercial airliners that crashed. Because pilots were tired, more tired than they wanted to, their flight was delayed, and they wanted to get there anyway, so they took off, and they were fatigued. They didn't even necessarily fall asleep, but they weren't checking their gauges right, and a different problem arose, and they weren't able to deal with it, and so they brought down a plane with 200 souls behind them. So these things really matter, and again, I'll give just huge props to the FAA. This is why the American aviation industry makes it so that you can set foot on an airplane and not worry about if it's going to land, because it is, and it's going to land safely. So these things matter. A little bit less so with drones, just because there aren't really lives at stake, and there are so many other just small safeguards. But I like to just kind of tip my cap to the FAA on that one. Now, if you weren't tired enough of acronyms and checklists, here's another one. Yeah, really, this is the worst module to pick for after food. So, what's the PAVE checklist? Perceiving risk. You can perceive risk with the PAVE checklist, which stands for Pilot in Command, Aircraft, Environment, and External Pressures. So, Pilot in Command, asking about risk about the pilot themselves. Am I ready for this flight? That means, do you have enough experience for this flight? What are your recent skills? Have you flown at all in the last 2 years? If the answer is no, then maybe you might not be ready for a flight and you need to do some practice first. And then your physical and emotional condition. Did you just have a fight at home and you're pissed off and you're going to take unnecessary risks? Maybe you should ask yourself those questions at least. Maybe the answer is yes, but I've taken enough steps and I'm aware that I'm not going to be doing anything stupid. Experience is on there too. Don't push yourself outside of your known flight limits. If you're used to flying in totally flat, open areas at 200-foot standard autopilot missions, all day, every day, and you do that every day for a couple of months, and then all of a sudden someone says, hey, we need you to do a bridge inspection where you're flying underneath a bridge, there are 15-mile-an-hour winds, and there are snow flurries as well. Do you have the experience from that? That's a way, way harder operational envelope to fly in for any sort of small unmanned aircraft pilot. So asking about the pilot, asking about your experience, recent skills, physical and emotional condition, again, will just help to make sure that, yep, you as a pilot are ready for the flight. Next up is the aircraft. Ask yourself, what are the limits of this aircraft? And is it the right aircraft for the mission? Pushing the aircraft itself out of its flight envelope is another dangerous thing to do. We talked about what are those limits. They're usually going to be set by the manufacturer. So making sure to follow those will make sure that you help to manage the risk associated with the aircraft. But also, is this the right aircraft for the mission? Knowing its operational history. Is this one a lemon that's had, a propeller almost break and almost bring the drone down 5 out of the last 6 flights? Maybe it's not best for a high-risk mission. Maybe you should get it inspected or use a different one in the fleet if you've got it. V for environment. Always bugs me when they make acronyms that don't actually use the right letters, but it is doesn't sound as good as PAVE. So what is the current weather environment? Is the terrain safe to fly? And are there any TFRs, temporary flight restrictions? Terrain's going to be a big one that applies to drones as well, just because most autopilots are typically going to take off and then fly at a fixed and level altitude. So if there's any terrain changes in there, the drone might actually fly into the side of a mountain. So understanding the terrain, understanding the environment as a whole is a good part of your PAVE operational checklists. And then TFRs, we went over those in depth already. Very, very important to the FAA to make sure that you follow or that you are aware of TFRs, don't fly in any of those flight restrictions. And last is going to be external pressure. Do I have any unsafe pressure to fly, the desire to impress someone, and what are my motivations for this flight? Again, this is the whole hey, the boss is pressuring you to get this done. Buck stops with you. It is your responsibility as the remote pilot in command. As part of your good risk management process, you need to ask yourself these questions. Do I have unsafe pressures? Do I have a desire to impress someone? Be it a boss, a coworker, a friend, whatever. If you're trying to show off, heck, we can go back to here. Showing off with people is often going to be that kind of macho attitude. Hey, yeah, look at this. I can impress you. I got this, no problem. But taking those chances is foolish, as it says. That is that's your antidote to that sort of thing. All right. So all of that put together, kind of going through that risk process, that's going to be your aeronautical decision-making process. Developing these risk assessment skills, using your resources, evaluating the effectiveness of your skills, improving them, that sort of thing. decision making as a whole, it's a fairly soft skill, and the questions on the test are going to reflect that. You might see a few that look a lot like the language that you've seen up here, especially when it comes to those different attitudes and how they can impact different flights. But more likely, the answer is about, you can kind of figure it out from looking at this stuff, that the answer is about being responsible, not taking unnecessary risks, but being aware of the risks and weighing them. It doesn't mean just not flying. That's, hell, the safest thing to do is to never fly, right? And then you'll never take a risk while flying. You'll take risks elsewhere in life, but maybe you'll never fly. But that's not what aeronautical decision making is about. It's about analyzing risk and being aware of the risk and doing your best to mitigate it. Not to just eliminate it by not flying. It's doing your best to actually continually improve that process. All right. Next up, crew resource management. Aeronautical decision making is about the individual pilot, a lot of the people thinking through their process. Crew resource management is the training related to using all available resources, which is what they count as your crew. That means human resources, you and everyone else that is out there, hardware, as well as any other information out there. So crew resource management, that's kind of your good buzzword out there for the test, is all of it, using all available resources to you. Human resources, like I said in the previous thing, this could be that you have the one guy flying the controls, another person that's your visual observer, and another person that's maybe managing the camera. Establishing effective interpersonal communication, leadership, and good decision making throughout that crew, that is all part of what is known as crew resource management. Bad crew resource management is characterized by bad communication, where someone doesn't listen to someone else, or someone's not willing to speak up. That example I gave earlier of having a visual observer that sees a power line or a tree that you're about to crash into and doesn't say anything, that's bad crew resource management. As with aeronautical decision making, it's a fairly soft module on the exam in terms of asking, like, what would be an example of good crew resource management? And you can kind of figure it out based on, all right, what's responsible? What's based on actually using all the resources available? What's making sure that someone speaks up and says, hey, I think you're about to hit that tree? Making sure that they know that they're able to say that and that they're not going to get punished for it. Punishing subordinates for calling out safety risks is an example of very bad crew resource management and should not be integrated in there. And if you're a good remote pilot in command, you should bring that up and say, hey, we have these bad procedures at work that say, excuse me, that say that if you bring up an error and if you make this mission not happen, then you're going to get punished. And that shouldn't be. That's bad crew resource management, and that creates unnecessary risks. And the last part with a lot of this stuff, good crew resource management should be integrated into all parts of the flight process. That means mission planning, that means deciding whether or not to fly, selecting an aircraft, inspecting an aircraft, as well as the actual flight operation. So not just the like, okay, we're flying stuff, the entirety of the operation should have crew resource management integrated into it. A subset or kind of similar part of crew resource management is something called Single Pilot Resource Management, or SRM. Similar to crew resource management, but it's the art and science of managing all of the resources available to a single pilot, both prior to and during the flight. So again, that's kind of your buzzword. It's utilizing all of the resources that you have available to you. Aeronautical decision making and using your kind of risk management processes, task management, making sure that you don't overburden yourself or others, automation management, terrain awareness, situational awareness. These are all components, but not an exhaustive list of things that would count for part of single pilot resource management. All right, you guys staying awake? We're getting there. So, next up, physiological factors. The catch-all example that the FAA gives, or the catch-all phrase, is you are not allowed to manipulate the controls, serve as a pilot in command, or serve as a visual observer if you are unable to safely carry out your responsibilities. That is vague, that is not well defined, and that is by design. They don't want to create any sort of loophole that lets you or someone that you work with fly while you are unable to safely carry out your responsibilities for any reason. They get too specific, that opens it up for loopholes, so it's very broad. It is the PIC's responsibility to make sure that all crew are not impaired. Drugs, alcohol, OTC medications, and other medical conditions can impact you. Again, you bring in all that kind of those hazardous attitudes. Yes, this can happen to you. And it's the PIC's responsibility to make sure that, that everyone is safe. So this could, like I said, be anything from weird drug interactions to even fights at home and stress that are not going to be, you know, really easy to detect. But making sure that you're in a position to fly is important. And a lot of this is not just if you are unable to, but if you have any reason to believe that you might not be able to safely carry out your mission, it's illegal to fly under that circumstance as well. So what are some of the physiological/medical factors? Hyperventilation, stress, fatigue, dehydration, heat stroke, drugs, and alcohol. These are all pretty obvious. I'm sure you all have a good understanding of what they are, but the FAA wants you to have a more detailed understanding, so let's do it. So, what are some of the symptoms of hyperventilation? Hyperventilation, breathing in and out too fast, can lead to a lot of things, like visual impairment, lightheadedness or dizzy sensation, a tingling sensation, hot and cold sensations, muscle spasms, and unconsciousness. These are all symptoms of hyperventilation. So slowing down, breathing slowly, and getting enough air is going to be important there. Stress, the next one on the list, can be acute for short-term stress or chronic for long-term stress, and can be caused by both physical stress, fatigue, or psychological factors like difficult work or personal situations. All of this type of stuff, again, is very much fair game for the test. Just knowing, hey, don't fly if you're stressed is not necessarily enough for some of the examples. What is the, what are some of the potential symptoms of chronic stress, or of acute stress? Well, it can trigger a fight or flight response. That you're stressed out, so you either just get super aggressive while flying, and that leads to unsafe and high-risk behavior. Chronic stress causes individual performance to fall off sharply, and pilots experiencing chronic stress should not fly. Figure out what's going on and solve the problem, and then you can fly. There's a lot of science and studies to actually support all of this stuff, but that's the FAA's definition of chronic stress. Fatigue, I love that picture. Frequently associated with pilot error. Like stress, fatigue can be either acute or chronic. Acute, of course, being maybe one night where you didn't sleep at all. Chronic being you only slept 4 hours a night for the last couple of weeks. That's what I'm in right now as a new father, so very sleepy. But it's chronic stress, or chronic fatigue. Acute fatigue can disrupt the timing of your skills in performing activities or disrupt your perceptual skills. It can be caused by stress. So stress by itself can actually be a causal factor for fatigue, so that you have multiple physiological conditions reducing your ability to fly well. Chronic fatigue usually has psychological roots or occasionally disease, and can lead to weakness, tiredness, heart palpitations, breathlessness, or irritability. If you are suffering from fatigue, do not fly. Basic, you're going to hear a lot of that. If you are suffering from XYZ, do not fly. That's another good one to remember on the test. If you're suffering from any of these conditions that you think might impair you, don't fly. It's another good kind of catch-all answer. Do you have a good reason to believe it's unsafe? Then the answer is don't fly. Unless you're absolutely sure that it's safe, don't fly. Dehydration and heat stroke. Dehydration is not just not having enough water. It can actually be caused even when you have enough water by things like hot temperature, wind, humidity, or other additional substances like coffee, tea, or alcohol. Familiar to anyone that has had those things, but worth noting for the test. It can cause fatigue and reduce performance, and the solution is to always drink enough water and be aware of your personal condition. Heat stroke is the inability of the body to control its own temperature when it gets too hot. It can cause a person to completely collapse, so as with dehydration, always carry an ample supply of water. You guys are in the field a lot, I'm sure you've experienced these things on different levels. Doing it with a drone in the air can definitely cause more problems than when you're on the ground sometimes. Drugs. There is no list of banned drugs. There is rather you just cannot fly if you know of any medical condition that would make you unable to meet the requirements for safe operation, or you are taking medication or other treatment that results in making you unable to meet the requirement for safe operation. Yes, all drugs, alcohol, pills, Benadryl, Dramamine, anything qualifies as a drug if it will impair you. So no specific list. Again, that's the FAA's way of making sure that there are no loopholes. If some new fancy designer drug comes out on the market and it's still illegal and you're saying like, oh, but this is legal, I'm allowed to. It's still illegal under FAA guidelines. That's the way that it worked with them because they don't deal with anything like a banned substance list. Any substance that for any reason might make you impaired means that you should not fly and it is unsafe for you to fly unless you can absolutely prove that you are in safe condition to fly. And here we go, alcohol. Yep, 0.04% is the blood alcohol concentration. That is typically half of the legal limit in most US states. If you have had any alcohol within the preceding 8 hours, it is also illegal to fly. If you are under the influence of alcohol, it is illegal to fly, BAC of 0.04% or greater, or if you are using a drug that affects your mental or physical capabilities. Again, pretty redundant, but here the actual kind of letter of the law limits on these sorts of things. No alcohol in the last 8 hours, under the influence at all, or blood alcohol concentration of 0.04% or greater. Which is, again, like I said, typically half the legal limit in most states. All right, so those are our human factors of flights. And with that, I should say congratulations. We've now covered all of the actual test stuff that's going to be on the test. Yay! Yay! All right, so what I'm going to dive into next, now that we've got it, is actually what the test day itself looks like here. So everything that I'm talking about now is not going to be directly on the test, but more like the information of what it looks like. So, and I'll go over this again briefly in the next and the last kind of section where we talk about the real world implications here. So first up, to register for the test, you got to find a test location. There's a link here that I'll send out to. If you Google just FAA test centers, you can Google it. There are a couple thousand of them across the country. They're at most major airports in most cities around the world will have one. For example, there's one right here in St. George that I just put up on the map there. You have to schedule your appointment over the phone. They'll ask you for all kinds of incredible personal information, social security number, credit card number, mother's maiden name, all of that stuff. Because it will wind up being used as part of your background check information too, just to verify that you can get a pilot's license and again that you're not on some sort of no-fly list. And it's a $150 fee, so you want to pay that over the phone. There is no real easy online thing. A lot of these test centers are kind of clunky. Again, it happens when you only have the FAA that doesn't want to change their policies and procedures very quickly. So the best way is to just schedule it over the phone, and some test centers might redirect you to a website to sign up or something like that. But get it scheduled, pay your fee at whatever test center is closest to you. The way that these tests actually work typically, so it's a 2-hour multiple choice exam, but it's not like they offer it only once every couple of months. Typically they're open, 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, and maybe 10 to 2 on Saturday and Sunday. And you just come in, they have a special test room where they'll sit you down at a computer, they'll give you that book. They're pretty strict actually about, depending on the test center, about taking stuff out of your pockets, so they might even metal detect you, no phones, no wallets, no additional materials. They'll put you in this room where there are cameras filming you, and they'll sit you down at a computer, start a clock, and you've got 2 hours to actually go through your exam. So it is in person, there are no online options to do it remotely. You do need to go to an FAA-approved test center to do it. And they are fairly strict about security, but it is offered at any time. I can almost guarantee if you called these guys and said you wanted to take it on Monday, you probably could. Questions about that, logistics-wise? It's pretty simple stuff. Preparing right before the test. I highly recommend revisit these slides. I went through everything. Heck, I've done this a lot. I've taken this test like a handful of times, and you saw, especially in some of the weather stuff, I didn't remember every single detail. Reviewing these slides the day before the test, making sure that you're fresh is going to help you out. Review the Part 107 summary. It's a 2-page document that I'll give you. Study the VFR chart template, like I was saying, that's your key. And heck, like a lot of this aeronautical decision-making stuff, get some rest. I don't know if you remember what they always told you before SAT exams. Get a good night's sleep, have a good breakfast, follow your morning routine. All that totally makes a difference, just kind of good test-taking procedures as a reminder. Tips and tricks. Use the booklet. Most of these questions can be answered with just information in the booklet. It's always worth, if you have no clue what you're doing, look around. Just go through some of those pages of that booklet, and there might be a table or chart that can actually help you out. When looking at those VFR charts, look at the, not just the guide, but looking around at some of the other stuff can actually help you out. Looking at a different VFR chart to give you some broader context, see some other examples of something, see if that can't help you figure out what you're looking at a lot of the time. So just use some critical thinking skills there. It's also multiple choice, so guess. There's nothing wrong with that. It's 3 questions, so worst case scenario, you have a 1/3 chance of getting the question right, which isn't that bad, especially when you only need a 70% on the test. And lastly, don't get caught off guard and don't get rattled. There will be at least one question on the test that you haven't seen before. It's just gonna happen. There's crazy, crazy, crazy detailed stuff that they pull out of nowhere. Don't let it rattle you. That 70% is gonna be pretty easy to pass if you miss 1 or 2 that you have no friggin' clue on or just Hail Marys. Then, after passing the test, this is all just paperwork. If you pass the test, great. All of the hard part is done. This is all just kind of legalese paperwork. You're going to want to register using the FAA. It's called their IACRA system. I don't remember what IACRA is an acronym for exactly, but basically it's their online pilot identity management system. Log in user, create a username and password, new application, follow the prompts. When you pass your test, you get this 17-digit knowledge test exam ID, sign electronically and submit for processing, and you get a temporary airman certificate in 2 to 3 weeks. A couple of things worth noting: when you pass your knowledge test, you get a physical piece of paper. That is your only evidence of the test. You don't get an email confirmation. Congrats, you passed your test, here's your information. You get a physical piece of paper that they physically emboss. So don't lose it, because that has your 17-digit knowledge test ID. I don't know of anyone that's lost it, but you might be able to dig up a record of the test, but if you have to, it's going to be a pain, so just don't lose that piece of paper. Yeah, you'll get your temporary airman certificate in about 2 to 3 weeks, typically. Strictly speaking, you're not allowed to fly commercially until you get that temporary airman certificate. If you pass the exam and if you're, not on a terrorist watch list, you're probably fine to fly. But you do need that temporary one. And then in the mail, eventually, I don't know what the wait time is now, but eventually you get your physical pilot's license ID card in the mail. I think it took me 2 to 3 months before mine got shipped in. But that's just all paperwork. So the hard part, the only hard part to this is the test. And like I said, we've got a whole bunch of other additional resources. In addition to these slides, aerotas.com/resources, we have a lot of information available to you if you want to go more in depth into any of these rules. If you drop me your business card, I'll send you all of this stuff, as well as any more additional resources. I don't necessarily recommend going through all of the additional resources, because if you start going down a rabbit hole, like I said, the full body of knowledge for all of this stuff is about 800 pages, something like that, spread across 3 or 4 different major pilot handbooks. What we just covered here today is plenty to pass the test. More than enough to get, into the mid-90% if you really, really just nail it. And more than enough to just pass 70% should be no problem. But there are additional resources available out there if you want them. So with that, we'll take our next break.